Okay, thank you for bearing with me. I'm trying to break these up so that the videos aren't too long. First of all, I think it's easier for you guys, and second of all, it's a lot faster to upload. Even that 15-minute video is taking an hour and 20 minutes to upload from through YouTube. So crazy. It takes a lot of time to get these things up. Anyway, let's go back to, we're now on slide 15 of the PowerPoint for Lillian Stavely. And she's talking about this dichotomy of ourself and how we, it's hard to understand who we are because we're this fleshly creature. And so she says, what am I in my flesh? I am but equal to the beasts of the field. In my heart and mind, I am corrupt humanity. In my soul, I know not what I am. So this is a common theme with the mystics. It's hard for us to know what we are in our soul. Julian of Norwich says, for instance, our soul or our higher self is so high that we can't really even see it in this lifetime. But she says, I know not what I am in my soul, or may be, but therein lies my hope, because I know that I'm more than, my physical being and even my mind. So for Stavely, she experienced 3 conversions, what she calls conversions, that really pushed her on to this spiritual way of life. And she says the first 2 were of terrible, terrible suffering. And the third was a great and marvelous joy. And I should add, Stavely's story that I don't talk about here is the initial impetus for her push toward Christ and God arose out of a crazy experience where she was struck by lightning. And she was greatly weakened physically. And then she found that her husband was losing interest because she was not her dynamic, beautiful self anymore. And so that really moved her in this direction of seeking comfort in God. And yet when she did finally, she felt like the first time she saw him, Christ, it was unbearable because all of her sins came up for her. And so she says, the third was a great and marvelous joy. One of the things that she says here on slide 16 is that she doesn't know how long exactly these experiences took. And that's a really typical experience for mystical experiences. You kind of get, you're pulled out of time, if you will. You're not really in time. So it's really hard to know how long they took. So then moving to slide 17, there you have her first conversion experience. And I can tell you, she had this horrible, unbearable, inexplicable pain and remorse when she encountered Jesus, and she seemed suddenly to be aware of him standing there in his marvelous purity, looking at me, not with any reproach, but with the sweetness of a wonderful invitation upon his face. But this was horrible to her because she became aware of all of her sinfulness. She also says that this inexplicable pain of remorse came upon her without any intention or premeditation on her part. So that's often a sign as well that mystics take that their mystical experience is genuine because they weren't planning on or expecting to have a mystical experience or to feel remorseful or any of these things. It just happens to them. And so that they feel like it is proof that they didn't conjure it up in their head, that this is coming from the outside. Now, the second instance of horrible anguish occurred on Easter morning at the close of the service. she says the horrible anguish came upon her as she was kneeling in the church. And she wasn't able to move or show her face for more than an hour. And to this day, she says she's not able to dwell upon the memory of that awful pain because she felt like she might go mad because there was so great a torture of her spirit. And then she says she endured to the utmost limit of her capacity for suffering. And then she said she didn't draw back. She went on to the bitter end. And so that's another, I think, theme with the mystics is when they do encounter suffering, they don't run away from it. They go into it. And in that suffering often is where the mystics find God. Richard Rohr always says, you come, you encounter God either through great love or great suffering. And so for many of the mystics, it's a case of going through great suffering. And she says this pain that she experienced first on Easter morning in church continued for 2 years. And finally she went to a literal mountaintop. Like she went up to the top of a mountain and she prayed, "Help me." And then there was silence, and then God filled her with love from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. And she went from agony to joy. So then in this third, so that's still part of the second conversion, what she counts as part of the second conversion. And then she had this third conversion, and she says this was this inexpressible joy. And she says it produced a fundamental alteration of my whole outlook and grasp on life. And it brought me into direct contact with God, and was the beginning of a total change of heart and mind and consciousness. The center of my consciousness, without any effort of my own, was suddenly moving bodily from a concentration upon the visible or earthly to a loving and absorbed concentration upon God. And she says, in the invisible God, a most amazing, undreamed of change, which remained permanent. So she achieved this place where she continued to be able to stay concentrating on God, though she says it fluctuated before coming to a state of equilibrium. So that was slide number 20. So now we're moving forward to slide number 21. And she says, after this experience, she had a flood of other spiritual experiences. And she says, and now Christ went away from me so that I adored him in God. And after this, for some weeks, she went through these extraordinary experiences, which she couldn't even imagine. And then she says she's not even going to talk about them. And so this is typical, like if you think of Paul, talking about his friend being lifted up to the third heaven, right? And he saw unspeakable things he can't and won't talk about. And so she says the same thing here. These are experiences that she can't even talk about. And she says she came to all these experiences, and this is the mystic saying, I didn't conjure this up in my head. This really happened because, she says, I came to these experiences with great innocence and ignorance, never having read any religious or psychological book. And I think now that it is perhaps easier, she thinks that it's easier to have these experiences if you haven't read the mystics, for instance, or the religious books or the psychological books. It just kind of comes upon you, and you may be more trusting of it that way because it's not something you read and longed for. So what's the purpose of these experiences? She says that, and here I'm on slide number 22, and she says the purpose is being able to perceive the reality of the life unseen. So she thinks that God took her through these experiences so that she would really know that there's a spiritual life and she became convinced of that. And she also became convinced that we can experience a taste of heaven on earth. She says it is possible for these things to come to us or we to them in quite a few years if we set our hearts on them. So it doesn't take a whole lifetime. You can actually do this in a few years. She says, first we must desire, and after the desire, steady and persistent, God will give. So she says, if we really just pursue this and desire these experiences, God will give them. And this is where I think Stavely is actually applicable and important, because she's not a modern person in terms of being a 20th century person per se. I mean, she's a little bit of she lives into the early 20th century, but she is a modern person in that she says, life is busy. If you look back to the medieval, to the mystics in the Middle Ages, they weren't really talking about how busy life is. But life does seem to speed up over time here. And so once you get into this modern era, you've got these people that talk about life is so busy. And so that's why I think Stavely is important for us, because she echoes a feeling that many of us have, right? How do I have time to have a mystical experience? My life is busy. I'm up, I've got deadlines, and I've got this to do and that to do, and I don't have time for this. So she says, but life is so busy, I have no time. You say, what if those hours spent in the train, those moments spent waiting for an appointment, that half hour taken for a rest, but which is not a rest because of the rushing, inharmonious turmoil of your thoughts. But I think she's saying, well, what if we shut down the turmoil of our thoughts? Of course, for us, as we're sitting waiting for a train or waiting at a doctor's office, we don't shut down our thoughts because we have these, right? And already you can see I have messages even as I'm sitting here talking to you, because it just never seems to stop. So obviously Stavely didn't experience that, and so in her lifetime you could find these moments where you had to wait, and you didn't have a phone to entertain you while you were waiting. For us, I think it has to be even more intentional, where we have to physically put the phone away, put all of the other distractions away, try to get the distractions out of our head so that we can spend time with God. She says, we've got all these other things that we end up packing. We're like travelers on a spiritual journey, and we pack way too much stuff on our journey that get in the way of us and God. And so she says, the stuff that we pack, what is it? Petty social interests and occupations, personal animosities, ambitions, worries, a revolving, endless chaos of futilities, known and praised by many of us as a busy life, right? And a lot of times, right, people will say, how are you? Oh, I'm so busy. I have this busy life. And we think that's good, right? Our life is full. But in fact, those things can often just get in the way of our relationship with God. The mind being given opportunity only at long intervals, and usually at stated and set times, to dwell upon the thought of God and the marvelous future of the human spirit. So we have to have those set times and that time period where we can just devote ourselves to God. And if we don't, then we just end up, with luggage full of stuff that's entirely useless to us. And so if you take a look on page 26, she addresses this idea of setting these things aside, and this, of course, comes from one of her books called The Golden Fountain. And she says, now it is possible to put out and obliterate this chaotic and useless state of mind which would appear to be the natural mind, and to open ourselves to receive the might and force and the joys and delights of Christ's mind. These joys are the heart of Christ speaking to the heart of his lover. So she says, we need to open ourselves to receive this. And she says that really there's this great wall that divides us from the consciousness of the presence of God. She says, that's really where we long to be. And I may copy the very beginning of her book, The Golden Fountain, because she does a really lovely job of describing how we may have faith, but we long for a deeper relationship. We long for something that is even beyond faith. And then she talks about how we can think about that, how we can get there. So I'd be happy to, I'll copy the beginning of that book for you all so that you can take a look at that. I'll put that up on the, as an optional read. She says, this great wall divides us from the consciousness of the presence of God. In this wall, there is one door and one door only, Jesus Christ. We have not found God because we have not found him first as Jesus Christ in our own hearts. So I think she's clearly very, very Christocentric. She's not as tied to scripture, for instance, as someone like Phoebe Palmer. However, she's so focused on Christ that I think that she can still be quite useful to us as Protestants and as evangelical Christians even. So she says, how do we approach God? She says we must have a set purpose and will towards God. Now, it's interesting because she's saying we must make the first effort. Now, obviously, if we're even making that effort, we're probably making it in response to God approaching us and being there for us. But she basically says that we've got to initiate that contact. And then she says God will then stabilize us. And I don't think that's far from the truth. God is present for all of us. And for some of us, he reaches out and contacts us. For others, though, he's present. He's subtly, opened that doorway. But then we really have to reach, to maybe knock on the door. So she says, if we continue the effort, he will bring it to fruition. Step by step, the Spirit rises. First the effort, then the gift. God's will and man's will, God's love and man's love, these working and joining harmoniously together raise man up into eternal life. So beautifully said. We want to think theologically here. Is this consistent with sola fide, with by faith only are we saved? Is this consistent with other Protestant tenets? So I encourage you to think through that and let me know what you think. So that is Lillian Stavely. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know about her. As I said, she is a creature of her time. I wish I could tell you she was such a trailblazer that she, was ahead of her time. I think maybe in some respects she was. I think that certainly her impulse toward this spiritual life shows that she was ahead of her time in terms of where the church was at this time. However, clearly with some of her writing, she's still, enmeshed in her time. I still think she's worth taking a look at. Let me know what you think. I look forward to reading your posts.